Hello and welcome to another episode of Two Guys and a Chainsaw. I'm Todd.
And I'm Craig.
Well, Craig, we've made it to 150.
It's hard to believe.
Happy 150th, my friend.
Unto you too, friend.
So just as we started out this podcast with The People Under the Stairs, with one of our favorite horror directors, Wes Craven, we thought we would come back to our roots, as it were, by doing Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, The Dream Warriors.
Yeah.
One of his more iconic movies. We've done the first Nightmare on Elm Street. We've done Nightmare on Elm Street 2. So why not do number 3? As soon as you suggested this, I think you suggested this one.
I did.
All that's been going through my head all week long has been, we're the Dream Warriors. Not gonna dream no more.
And you know I love it when you sing.
I know you do. I had to get that in. Oh man, oh gosh, this movie, right? That song. I got to talk about the song real quick.
Do it.
You know, this movie was big when I was, okay, we're talking 1987, so I would have been in what, 3rd grade or 4th grade or something like that. But man, this song was all over the place. It was on the radio. Everybody was Freddy Krueger, this and that and the other. I was obsessed with Freddy Krueger at this time. I don't think I'd even seen the first 2 Nightmare on Elm Streets. I was a little too young for my parents to allow me to do so. Your parents might have allowed you to do so.
Well, I remember this was one of those movies that my dad had on VHS. Well, not this one, excuse me. The original was one of the ones that my dad had on VHS. And I wasn't allowed to watch it. Like, my mom was adamant that I was not allowed to watch the first one.
So, naturally, you watched it.
Yeah, so I watched it when they were, I don't know, asleep or gone or something. But yeah, this one, I always cite this one as being one of my favorites of the sequels, and it is. You know, like you said, we've already done parts 1 and 2. We also did New Nightmare, which I also love and also cite as one of my favorite sequels. But this one, you know, it was fairly early in the whole Freddy days, and this was the one where it really kind of started to pick up mainstream. I mean, the first 2 did well for horror movies, but it was really by part 3 where Freddy Krueger really entered the lexicon of pop culture, and
yes.
You're right, he was everywhere. He was making appearances on MTV. It was either during this one or maybe part 4 when he had like his own like 976 number for a while.
Call Freddy.
Yeah, right.
Foolish friends, Freddy Krueger is on your phone. Dial this number now. I've got some tales to tell. Freddy's favorite bedtime stories. Dead time stories. All brand new. Straight from my boiler room to your home. It's Freddy Krueger on your phone. So dial this number now if you dare. Tell him Freddy sent you.
$2 the first minute, 45 cents each additional minute. Children, get your parents' permission before you dial.
I want to know what Freddie said on the 976 number. I mean, what did he do on that? Did you just call up and he just like berate you for a while?
Yeah, I guess so. I can only imagine.
Maybe he told ghost stories. I don't know. And
this replays. You know, they play Nightmare on Elm Street marathons on American cable fairly regularly, and so I catch this one every once in a while, but I always, you know, catch it kind of in the middle, or I'll see like 20 minutes of it or something. And this is the first time that I've sat down and watched it from start to finish in a long time. And while it certainly shows its age, I still really appreciate it because this is kind of this one in part 4. Part 4 did the best of all of them as far as making money is concerned. This one, I think, is like 2nd or maybe 3rd in terms of money making. But this one and part 4 are kind of the ones that bridge from Freddy being super dark and scary to really jokey and comedic and funny. And I like my Freddy however he comes. I like the dark ones. They're fun. He is certainly scary. You know, the mere idea of him, you know, this nightmare demon or whatever he is that can get you in your sleep and nobody believes you and there's really not a whole lot you can do to protect yourself because everybody has to sleep. That's scary in and of itself. And then later on, when it started getting a little bit more comedic and he was popping off one-liners left and right, I still enjoyed it. Robert Englund seemed to take so much joy in playing this character and really making it his own that I've really enjoyed every one of his incarnations of it. I mean, we can just go ahead and completely ignore that terrible, terrible remake. Robert Englund is Freddy Krueger, and this movie, I think, just has one of the coolest premises of all of them, and some good performances and some great kills, great ones, some great Freddy one-liners. We've got the return of Heather Langenkamp, who I love from the first movie. I'm never going to say Heather Langenkamp is an amazing actress, but I love her. Yeah, no, she's really not. But I love her in these movies. And then you've got just some really cool stuff. Like, this was Patricia Arquette's first movie. Mm-hmm. And she went on to be an incredibly successful actress and, a renowned actress in both film and television. You've got Lawrence Fishburne.
So funny to see Lawrence, very young Lawrence Fishburne, doing a Samuel Jackson.
Yeah.
In a way, it's like, wow, Samuel Jackson really hadn't been around yet, but it seems like he's doing a great Samuel Jackson impression in this movie.
And he's billed as Larry Fishburne, which is hilarious, and he's got a relatively small part, but at the same time, he's good at it. He's a likable character, even though he's a very small character. Just a lot of really another one of my favorite movies from the 80s, and I can only assume that, or hope, I guess, that it's one of yours too, was Stand By Me. Are you a fan?
Yeah, I'm a fan.
The guy who played River Phoenix's older brother in the movie, his name was Eyeball. He's in this movie, so it was a big recognizable face for me there. Just a lot of cool stuff going on, and like I said, it does show its age, but from a nostalgic perspective, I still am a big fan of this movie.
Yeah, I have to say, this had also been the first time in a while that I had seen it too, so I was so excited to get back. And just like you said, I also cite this as one of my favorites. I'm going to have to say that this time around watching it, you're right, it shows its age, and that bothered me so much. It really did. I mean, I still enjoyed it, and I like it for what it is, but I don't think I can any longer say... I've got, I used to kind of pit this one and New Nightmare a little bit against each other. I used to say, okay, the first one is the best. It's just so good in every way. And then this one and New Nightmare, I can't say which I like better. I think at least after now, I can definitely say I like New Nightmare a lot better than this movie, if I have to rank them in order, And,
yeah.
And that's because it's a little overwrought at times. It gets a little dramatic in moments. And also, I was a little surprised seeing at this time how slow it is. I mean, it really takes its time introducing the characters and showing us all these people. And I can't... I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I remembered there being a lot more Freddy in this movie than it turns out there really is.
That's so funny, because that's one of the things that I was actually impressed by how fast-paced it was.
Really?
Things are happening all the time.
Well, that's true. And I don't mean to say that the plot isn't moving forward. It's definitely moving forward. But the stuff that we kind of expect to see in a Freddy movie, these kills and these whatever like that, I felt like that was really spaced out. And we spent a lot more time outside of the dream world than we did inside the dream world. And the scares, I thought, were pretty far between and pretty much all piled toward the end of the movie, I thought, the last third of the film. And that's not how I remembered it being,
Yeah, I agree with you that it does get pretty, dream heavy at the end. And I actually found that to be a little bit disappointing, because some of the scenes that I remembered happened so quickly in the end. And I didn't remember them going by so quickly, and I wish that we would have spent a little bit more time with them. I mean, I still enjoyed them, and I thought they were really creative, but they just, it seemed like they realized, we've got 30 minutes left. Hurry up.
Yeah, I know. Well, And I was watching this with my dad and my uncle, and we're over here. Actually, we're back in the States now for this week for kind of to celebrate Thanksgiving. And so I'm here with them, and I said, hey, you guys want to sit down and watch this movie? Neither of them are horror fans. We've had my dad on here once before, and it was a blast. And I thought, well, maybe he'd like to join us for the podcast. And honestly, after watching it with them, they were both kind of disinterested in doing the podcast. It kind of proved to me, and I think looking at it a little bit through their eyes, that I think unless you are already a bit of a Nightmare on Elm Street fan, unless you're already kind of invested in this character, this isn't really the movie for you. It's at least it's maybe not the movie to start with.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I agree with that entirely. You have to be a fan. You have to be invested. This movie, I think, I love reading behind the scenes stuff. And because, this came out in 1987, it was, 30 years ago. And it's been popular. It's one of, regardless of how we judge its quality now, it remains one of the most beloved sequels in the franchise. Mm-hmm. And people typically cite it. And so, of course, people are going to talk about it. And it was just interesting to read some of the backstory. Wes Craven was not interested in making Nightmare on Elm Street a franchise at all. In fact, he did not want the open ending that Robert Shea wanted for the first film. He didn't want it to be open for a sequel, but Robert Shea insisted. And then when they went forward with making Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Craven didn't want to have anything to do with it. And he didn't have anything to do with it. But the success of the sequel convinced him that it could be a franchise, and so they were able to get him back on board for this one. And he wrote a treatment of the script that basically kind of followed the same plot line that this one does, except it was on a much grander scale, and there were some significant differences. This one is centered around these Elm Street kids. It's later revealed that they are the last of the Elm Street children, the last of the children whose parents killed Fred Krueger. And they're all having terrible dreams, and so they end up getting put in a mental institution, basically. And they're all there, and it turns out that they all have like dream powers. And so they kind of band together to fight Freddy. Wes Craven's initial script for this had that same basic premise, but there were some differences. Instead of coming back as an outsider and a professional, Nancy from the first movie was a patient in the hospital with the other kids, and it was just much more grandiose. Like, one of the Dream Warriors was able to like turn into some big like Transformer style robot at the end, and one of the characters who made it into the final script, Kincaid, could fly, and another character who made it into the script, Taryn, could turn invisible. And the studio liked the general premise, but they knew that it was way outside of their budgetary restraints, and so they brought in a different screenwriter, and they changed some things up, and it became what it was. Robert Englund also had written a treatment for the third installment, and his installment was titled Freddy's Funhouse. And it was supposed to center around the sister of Tina, who was a character in the first movie, who was one of the first people killed. And she was supposed to start having all of these dreams, these macabre dreams about her sister's death. And of course, that led her to investigate, and she ended up back in Springfield and or Springwood, whatever the name of the town is. And it all centered around the house from the original, Nancy's house from the original, and Freddy had kind of turned it into a Home Alone-style booby trap carnival-type house, and he would lure people there and trap them, and there would be all kinds of memorabilia from the previous two films. Mm-hmm. And the studio liked some of his ideas a lot, but they eventually decided to go with what we ended up with. And all of those different treatments sound like they have promise. There was also an initial concept was to have Freddy come out into the real world and start haunting the actors from the first two movies, which was rejected by the studio, but ultimately revisited when Wes Craven did New Nightmare.
Yeah.
So there were all kinds of ideas floating around, and this is what they settled on, and I'm not disappointed. I like it. I like this concept. The Dream Warrior concept, I think, is really clever, and I frankly, I wouldn't mind seeing it revisited at some point if we get any future Nightmare films.
Yeah, and actually, I was a little surprised, again, how my memory fails me a little bit, in that this is obviously, the concept and the way that they're going with it is it's almost this Avengers style, they all assemble, and they're supposed to each have their own powers to battle Freddy at the end. Yet, in the execution of it, they're quite weak.
Yeah.
And it's not quite what it sounds like we're describing. You would think there would be this major battle scene at the end where each person is using their special dream powers to get the one up on Freddy. But as it sort of turns out, their dream powers kind of pop up and then they get offed. I mean, it's pretty quick. Like, so-and-so is going to be a badass at her dream, and then she dies. I mean, we're going to talk about all this, but then she dies, like, within 5 minutes. And the same thing with at least a couple of the other characters. And then when it comes to the finale, it isn't really a case of where their collective powers worked together to fight him off. It's really just, again, just a sort of other circumstances that make it happen. And so in that way, it's a little disappointing, I think. I mean, it feels like there was even more promise there for something extremely clever and extremely interesting, and that's the way it's going. But instead, and I don't know, you could maybe even say this is a strength of the movie, that it subverts your expectations here and sort of neuters these characters pretty quickly, which has the effect of showing Freddy as a pretty unbeatable guy.
Yeah.
So, it does that. But, once again, it doesn't really give most of the characters much to do for most of the movie. So that's, it's like a lot of setup, and then the payoff is not at all really what you expected.
That is totally fair. I guess my response to that would be, like you said, it kind of subverts your expectations, but in the end, it really just kind of establishes that they go in there with this confidence, and ultimately...
Yeah,
you can't beat Freddy.
Yeah,
as tough as you may be, you're on his turf, and it's. But I agree 100% with what you're saying. The thing that kind of eases that for me is that these characters, at least the vast majority of them, are very, very likable, and so I enjoyed watching them together, and I enjoyed watching them kind of inspire confidence in one another, and I was rooting for them.
That's true.
Yeah, it was disappointing, especially as we've already mentioned in the last half hour, when some of them finally get their opportunity to face off against Freddy, and it lasts about 30 seconds, and then, they're just very easily dispatched. It's disappointing, but at the same time, I was sad to see them go. Like, I had an emotional investment in them, and I can still appreciate it, even though I think your criticism is totally fair.
They're the underdogs. It's that underdog story, and they're all kind of losers in a way, and not all of their own making, but they all have these issues, and they're bonding. The thing that kind of joins them together is this issue that they all have with Freddy, and it's the one thing that they can work together. It's the one thing they can all sort of focus on and try to fix in their lives. And so, yeah, you are rooting for these people who all have these different issues. It's a great premise. It really is. It starts out with Kristen Parker, who is played by Patricia Arquette. And it has a kind of a sequence of dream within a dream kind of aspects to it. But basically, what it starts out with is she's kind of dreams herself into that Elm Street house, the one that's in kind of decay and decrepit and whatnot. She's putting together a model of it that goes into her room, and she's doing this to stay awake. So we know she's already being terrified by these dreams, and then her mother comes in and scolds her quite a bit.
She's the typical Elm Street horrible parent.
Yeah.
All of the Elm Street parents are awful.
They are.
Hello, Mom. Don't hi, Mommy. What are you still doing up? It's past 1.
Just thought I'd wait for you.
Well, I'm home. Now you can get to sleep. Come on. Underlay.
I'm really not tired.
Kristen, don't start with me. You know what your shrink said.
He's full of it.
I'm not going to let you get into an argument. Not tonight. Now get to sleep.
And all of Wes Craven's parents really are awful in most of his movies. And so then anyway, she goes to sleep and she dreams herself in this house where she goes through and there's a little girl and there's the, all of the stuff that we're familiar with the nursery rhymes and everything. And Freddy starts to chase her. And then she wakes up. And after she wakes up, she goes into the bathroom. And we get really cool effects, and that's the thing that I also love about you and I both love about these movies too. Is as corny as they can sometimes be, and as unrealistic as they can sometimes be, it's still really fun to see practical effects again.
Yeah, pre-CGI, all practical,
and the work that goes into it is just quite impressive. And what they are able to pull off all practical is also pretty impressive. And so yeah, like her sink comes to life and starts attacking her, turns into Freddy almost. He slashes at her. At the same moment, the mother hears screaming and comes in and interrupts her in the bathroom. And when she bursts open the door, she's standing there with a razor blade in her hand and her arm cut. Now, we saw Freddy cutting her arm in the dream world, but then in this world, she's got a razor blade in her hand. And so her mother thinks she's suicidal and then sends her to this mental hospital. And that's where she meets all the other characters that we're going to be spending the rest of the movie with.
The mental hospital is Weston Hills. Nightmare on Elm Street is pretty good about continuity. There are some things, like Freddy's abilities and stuff are a little questionable from movie to movie, but otherwise their continuity is pretty good. Weston Hills plays a really significant part throughout the series. We find out in this movie that this is the mental institution in which Freddy's mother was raped by 100 maniacs, and that was his inception. And then, of course, we have this whole movie taking place here. It comes up again several times throughout the series, and it's a primary set piece for Freddy vs. Jason. You find out in Freddy vs. Jason that kids are still being kept in Weston Hills, dealing with their dream stuff. So that's kind of cool, some of these little Easter egg things. We hear on the radio, Lawrence Fishburne, who is an orderly, we hear on his radio that there have been a series of teen suicides in town. And then we meet all of these characters just boom, 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 right in a row. We meet Taryn, who's played by Jennifer Rubin. She's kind of the tough girl. Her issue is that she has struggled with addiction, drug addiction in the past. Jennifer, who is the wannabe TV star, played by Penelope Sudrow, and she has been self-harming. She's been burning herself with cigarettes. Now, we find out later that she's been doing that to keep herself awake, but of course they're keeping an eye on her because of that. Philip, I don't really know what his issue is.
Sleepwalking.
Sleepwalking. Yeah. He's the kid from Stand By Me, Bradley Gregg. Kincaid is this tough black kid.
He's just an angry black guy, I guess.
He's just an angry black guy.
That's why he's in the institution.
And I read that he didn't even want to audition for this movie, but his agent talked him into it, and he had to go through the rain and bad weather to get there, and then when he got there, they kept him waiting for hours, and finally when he got in to audition, the director was like, just do whatever you want to do. And he said to the director, fuck you, and then started throwing stuff around the room. And the guy was like, you're hired. Then there's Joey, played by Rodney Eastman, and he apparently had been an orator in high school, a debater, but now he's mute. And the implication is that he's been so terrorized by Freddy that he's now mute. And we meet Dr. Neil Gordon, the young, attractive male psychiatrist, played by Craig Wasson. And then the uptight, grumpy, older doctor, Dr. Elizabeth Sims, played by character actress Priscilla Pointer, who's very recognizable. Yeah. They bring Kristen in, and she's freaking out because they want to sedate her. And she even grabs a scalpel and cuts one of the orderlies. And the only person who is able to calm her down steps into the room, and that is Nancy. Once again played by Heather Langenkamp, who calms her down by making it evident that she knows what she's talking about. And then it goes on from there. It's the story of these kids and them trying to deal with their issues and nobody believing them, just as is always the case in these movies. Except in this one, they have an ally in Nancy who knows what they're going through because she's been through it. And she's there to help. I just love that Heather Langenkamp is given kind of this hero arc in this story, because she was tough in the first one. She was presented as this, of course, the virginal, sweet, final girl, but ultimately she was the only one tough enough to stand up to him, and now she's back, and she is a worthy adversary, and I just love it.
Yeah. And this is where I think it's this whole sequence where the movie shows its age just a little bit. There's some kind of dated writing in here. It's very cliche now in the way that we meet all the characters, where the doctor is going from room to room, and there's a different excuse for him to pop in on each of the patients. But when he does, or when Nancy is, looking around to them, he pops into the rooms, and we instantly get to see what their issue is, because they have some witty quip, or they have something they're saying, like, yeah, they say I'm a sleepwalker, that kind of thing. And then I thought that at this point where they have Kristen cornered in the room, and she just starts reciting the nursery rhyme, and then we hear somebody finish reciting the nursery rhyme, and we turn around and it's Nancy in the doorway, and the music swells and stuff.
7, 8, better stay up late. 9, 10, never sleep again.
I know that, probably seeing this in the theater when it first came out, this is probably a big moment for everybody. Like, oh, wow, we're getting to see Nancy come back. But at this point in this movie, it all comes across as pretty overly dramatic, I think. And
sure.
And a little too Hollywood. I don't know, I think also it shows a little bit of its low-budget nature, that it's got sort of this big-budget mindset, but the reality of it is that the acting is not always quite so good, and the cinematography is not quite so grand, and even the score is a little disappointing at times. And so it all just seemed to fall just a little short of what I remembered, in watching it this time around. It is what it is, it's an old movie. That's fine.
Right.
It's just not as polished as one would hope it could be, for this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I agree 100%.
But that's fine. Nancy and the doctor, they end up talking and chatting, and she's real coy about things. She's not ready to jump in and talk, wisely so, not ready to jump in and, tell Neil, oh, yeah, well, this is because they're all having this problem because, there's a crazy guy attacking them in their dreams, right?
Right.
But she does have this hypnocil on her, which he notices after she drops her purse, and he picks it up. Again, one of these hilarious little tropes, but anyway.
Right.
That introduces hypnocil, which factors in later as well.
Yep.
In later episodes. And so she's taking this to suppress dreams. And he later goes back and looks it up on his computer, which I thought was funny, too. He didn't pull a book off the shelf. He pulled up his computer in the pre-internet age. He must have had, like, the encyclopedia.
Like a floppy disk?
On a floppy disk. Like, what was that? I was a little shocked at that part.
Like one of those big, 6x6 floppies.
This guy,
I thought the same thing.
He must get floppy updates in the mail so that he can stay in tune with all the latest experimental drugs. But anyway, so that's that. But then Kristen has another dream, and this is quite an interesting dream where she's back in the house. And once again, you can really see the money that went into this as far as, practical effects. There's a point at which she goes into a room and the whole room starts basically falling apart on her. And then what bursts through the wall but this giant
penis.
Freddy snake. Yeah, it's pretty phallic. And I guess I read, as you probably did too, that originally this was even more phallic looking than it looks in the movie. They had to darken up Freddy's pinkish hue a little bit by throwing green goo all over him. So you get this big slimy Freddy snake that starts eating her, much in the same way, I think, as, I don't know which came out first, but remember, was it Poltergeist 2? when the worm in the tequila also gets big like this and starts to swallow somebody whole.
Yeah, I
don't
remember
know.
that.
It's very reminiscent of that.
I have to say that I found this scene to be very ambitious.
Oh my gosh!
And I thought that it looked great. I mean, I thought that really, even by today's standards, it looked
incredible.
Pretty darn good.
Well, especially when she gets, she pulls Nancy into the dream, and that turns out to be her dream power. She can pull other people in.
Right.
And so Nancy pops into the dream through like a broken mirror, and she grabs a piece of the mirror and stabs the snake, which drops her, and then, it's back up, and this head, which looks just like Freddy in a really gross, giant way, looks at them both and says a few words. And, this is like a puppet. And it's really convincing.
Yeah.
Just loads of articulation on it. It's dripping green slime. It looks at them. It's floating there. And he's like, "Oh, you again," or something like that. And then disappears.
Oh, it just looks at her and says, "You." And then she kind of freaks out. And I love that. God, it's just, when you're invested in particularly like a series like this, and you have that moment where these two iconic characters from the first movie come face to face, and Freddy sees her and just says, "You."
Yeah. It's cool.
And then they run away. Like, I can only imagine being in the theater opening weekend of this movie and that happening. I can just only imagine the reaction of the crowd. Like, it's so exciting to see these two come back face to face.
Yeah, it was really good. Really good. We get 2 more kills coming up. And this is, again, something I didn't remember. I kind of remembered that all these characters sort of band together, but a couple of them die pretty early on.
Yeah.
One of them, Philip, who makes these marionettes in his room. This is one it's hard to forget, because as he falls asleep, Freddy, in his dream, slashes basically down each of his arms and down his legs to his foot, these long slashes, and then it's like he pulls the veins or the tendons or something out and uses them to control him like a marionette walking down. And that's pretty disgusting and inventive.
It is. And because they know that he sleepwalks, they don't immediately intervene.
Yeah.
But before that happens, I mean, it's a little tiny thing, but I just thought it was so cool. Like, you see Philip sleeping there, and then it pans to his marionettes, and one of them that is very vague in form transforms into Freddy, and it's all done through stop motion, like claymation, and it's not like the most amazing stop motion I've ever seen, but it's kind of cool. And just the fact that it was pre-CGI and they were doing all of this practically, and, I read that they started with really the Freddy marionette, and then they just kind of kept making it more and more vague, and then they reversed the film. They played it backwards so that it appeared that he was becoming more like Freddy over the course of just maybe, 2 or 3 seconds. But it was so neat.
Yeah.
The kills in this movie, I just think, are really creative. He marionettes the guy out through the halls. Like, some people see him, some people don't, through a chained and locked door.
Yeah. How does that work, though? There were a couple questions I had about this movie, and that was one of them.
Yeah.
Like in the real world.
I don't know.
Yeah, it seems to break rules just a little bit. Like Freddy can manipulate them in their dreams, and it has an effect on the real world. But man, it's like he just disappears through a locked door in the real world.
Right.
And that part I didn't quite get.
No, yeah, they play it fast and loose with the rules, but that's not really uncharacteristic of the series as a whole. And then he ends up on the top of this big tower, and all of the other patients see him and are screaming at him through a window, and then you see, like, enormous Freddy, like, looming over this tower, marionetting this kid, and he just uses his blade to slice the tendon strings, and the kid falls. And of course the doctors say that he committed suicide, or it was a sleepwalking accident, and they won't believe the kids, and that's just kind of par for the course throughout the next few things. The next death, I think, is Jennifer. Is that right? The one who wants to be the actress? Mm-hmm. And this is one of the most iconic deaths in the series, period.
Yeah.
She wants to be an actress, and so she's up late watching late night TV. And Lawrence Fishburne, Max, I guess is his name. I don't care. Lawrence Fishburne comes in and tells her she needs to go to bed, but she's like, "Oh, come on, just let me stay up just a little bit." And so she's watching late night TV by herself in the lounge, and she flips to the Dick Cavett show. Was the Dick Cavett show on in our day? I don't remember it at all.
I don't remember it either. I remember Johnny Carson. I don't remember Dick Cavett, but I guess he was. He must have been.
Yeah, he was a real late-night TV host, and they got him for this movie. They originally casted a different actress to be his guest on this very brief segment, but I guess kind of last minute they asked him, who would you like to have as the guest? And he said, I'd like to have Zsa Zsa Gabor because she's the dumbest person I've ever met in my life, and if I ever wanted to see somebody killed by Freddy, it would be her.
I'm sure that's something they didn't quite tell her when they cast her.
Oh, I'm sure, right? And I don't know if he actually said it, but that's what I read, so I'm going with it. So, but it's this funny scene where Dick Cavett is interviewing Zsa Zsa Gabor.
Study, work, and then maybe you can make it.
Can I ask you something?
Certainly.
Who in the fuck what you think?
And stabs her, and then the TV goes out, like the station goes out. And Jennifer gets up and walks up towards the TV, and Freddy, sprouts out of the TV. Like, his arms come out of the sides of it, and his head comes out of the top with the antennas coming out of his head. And he grabs her and picks her up and says,
This is it, Jennifer. Your big break in TV. Welcome to prime time, bitch.
He smashes her head into the screen, and she gets electrocuted. And it's one of the most iconic moments, one of the most iconic and most quoted lines from the whole thing. And I guess that the first part of the line was what was scripted. And they filmed it several times, and Robert Englund delivered the line as written, but then they wanted a different angle, and so they set up the camera at a different angle, and he said the welcome to prime time line, and the director liked it so much that he spliced the two lines together, and that's what we get. And it's like I said 3 or 4 times in the last minute, one of the most iconic lines in the whole franchise. And I just this movie, I mean, if you're gonna talk about this franchise, you can't not talk about this movie. It's one of the best ones.
It's true, and it is. It's memorable. So one of the things, though, about this that I think is hilarious is I can't remember who it is who finally discovers her. I think maybe it's Larry Fishburne or whatever, or one of the doctors. But, they open the door and they look in, and there she is hanging out of the TV set. Her head is inside the TV set. Her legs are off the floor, and the TV is all smoking. And then her death is also ruled a suicide, just like the guy who fell off the roof.
Right. Like she jumped up there.
Shoved her head through the screen. Like, how does that even work?
Meanwhile, there's this subplot where the Dr. Neil, I think this is the first time that it happens, but it keeps happening. When he's at Jennifer's funeral, he sees this nun, and he goes up and talks to her, and she tells him that the only way to banish the evil spirit is to bury his remains, or something along those lines. And initially, he's very confused by it, but he ends up bumping into her several more times. And as it turns out, even though the Elm Street parents killed Freddy, he was never given a proper burial, and that's why he can still do all this stuff, and he needs to be buried in sacred ground or something. But as it turns out, this nun is actually Freddy's mother, who was the one who was raped. She was a volunteer at the hospital. She was accidentally left in this ward for the criminally insane. She was there for several days. She was raped hundreds of times, and when they finally got her out, she was almost dead, but alive and pregnant. And that mythology is introduced here and then is carried through the rest of the series. So this is where we get the Son of 100 Maniacs whole storyline.
And that's kind of interesting. You know, like from the first movie, we get Freddy's a child murderer. At some point, it's implied also maybe a child molester as well, you know, depending on how dark they want to make it. But then it's not just that this is a bad guy, but it's like he was born from, you know, badness or whatever. Like he was kind of destined to also be this bad guy. So they didn't have to do that, you know, because Freddy, at least the conceit is that Freddy comes back because he's taking revenge upon the parents who took the vigilante justice, you know, who took everything into their own hand and went and burned him. So that already makes its own sense. But then when you add this additional layer of his mother being raped by 100 maniacs, it's like, geez, how much more terrible can they make this guy's backstory?
Yeah, well, they continue to build on it almost to a ridiculous point. Like in, I don't know, 6, one of the worst ones, Freddy's Dead, they introduced this whole thing about how when he was being burned by the parents, he was approached by these nightmare demons, and they're the ones that helped him come back. And it gets more complex, but at least they were, you know, giving us a little bit more backstory here.
Her child, Freddy, the bastard son of 100 maniacs.
Nancy finally basically convinces Dr. Neal that she knows what's going on, and she tells him the truth, and they all have this group session where she tells them, you're not crazy, you know, I've been through it too, he's really this guy, he was a child killer, and now he's back in dreams, and she's like, but Kristen is awesome, and she can bring us into her dreams, and all of you are special, and you have these special powers, so let's go under group hypnosis and we can all be together and we can figure out what to do. So Neil hypnotizes all of them, but at first they don't realize they're hypnotized. So Joey goes off, like he's been crushing on this hot nurse who looks like she stepped right out of a porno.
Yeah.
She draws him away, and then the rest of them are just kind of talking, and then weird things start to happen, like the doctor is playing with like those clicky kinetic balls that like you plop one and then the other ones go whatever, and they all start flying around the room, and so they realize that they are in the dream, and so they all start revealing their powers, and it turns out that Taryn is like this badass mohawk wielding, you know, kick butt girl, and the wheelchair kid Will can walk, and he's a wizard because he's like a Dungeons and Dragons nerd, so he can do like wizardy stuff. Kincaid is super strong, and Kristen can do gymnastics.
It's a great superpower. Well, that on top of being able to pull other people into her dreams. So she gets like a double power there, I guess.
That's true. So they're all having fun, like playing with their powers or whatever. Meanwhile, Joey is being seduced by this nurse. And she tells him she likes him or whatever, and then she immediately takes off all her clothes. She's completely topless. She's got these huge boobs. I mean, this lady had to have been a model or something. I mean, she's gorgeous. You know, I didn't read this on our usual sources, you know, our in-depth research, but I read that initially they had shot it so that when it is revealed, the way that it's revealed that it's Freddy now is she's on top of him and they're making out, and she starts like biting and pulling out his tongue, and she eventually shoots tongues out of her mouth and they tie him to the bed. Initially, there was going to be a sequence where from like the neck down, it was going to be this actress fully topless with her boobs out, and from the neck up, it was going to be Freddy's head.
Oh my gosh.
And they just decided that it was too weird and gross. But if you Google it, you can find the images because they shot it. I've never seen any video, but you can find the stills.
Oh man.
And it is creepy and gross to see Freddy's head on this, you know, big boobied lady.
Yeah, it's so funny to read stuff like this, and there's a lot of stuff like this about this movie. It's almost charming and quaint, where they hold themselves back, like, this is going to be a little too bloody. Oh, this is going to be just a little too gross, because you just can't imagine anybody in the horror genre today making those kind of judgments.
Right.
If anything, it's like, oh yeah, that's going to be really great. We got to up the gore here, you know?
Right. Oh yeah. yeah, I love reading this behind the scenes stuff, and like I said, there's so much, and there was a whole big documentary about the whole series. Was it called Never Sleep Again?
That's
that what
right.
It was called?
Yeah, on the DVDs, and it's very good.
It is very good, but it's long. It's like 3 or 4 hours long, but they go into great detail on every single one of the sequels, and there's some really good stuff there. If you're a fan of the franchise, I really recommend watching that documentary because there's really cool behind-the-scenes stuff in there. But at this point, it kind of becomes a rescue mission to get Joey. When they all wake up out of the hypnosis, Joey doesn't wake up and he's in a coma. So Nancy and Neil get fired, and they kind of go off on their own. And Neil tells Nancy about how Freddy's remains need to be buried in consecrated ground. And she says, well, there's only one man who knows where they are. And so they go visit her dad, which is John Saxon reprising his role from the first movie. And at first he won't tell them. He's just like, I'm done with it. I've already lost too much to this. I'm not going back. So he won't tell Nancy. So Neil tells Nancy, you go back to the hospital, because they get a call that Kristen has been sedated and put in the quiet room. And so the other kids are freaking out. They know she's in trouble. So Neil says, Nancy, you go back and deal with that, and I'll deal with your dad. And at that point, their storylines kind of diverge. Neil takes Nancy's dad to first he goes to a church where he gets some holy water and a cross, and...
Yeah, this whole bit, it's just hilarious. Again, another part where the movie gets just a little silly. I think the whole sequence with her dad in the bar is, once again, it's so cliche, and it's so over dramatic. Just almost every bit of it. Even John Saxon's acting in this is kind of it is what it is, but it's really, really goofy. Then he goes to that church and he gets the holy water, and it's kind of clever. Like John Saxon's just drunk at this point, and he takes his bottle out of his hand and dumps it out, and then when he goes into the church, that's what he uses to fill up with the holy water. But then there's this quick little scene where he goes and he takes a crucifix off of like the wall in the church, and this priest stops him and says, well, he doesn't really stop him because he's on the other side of this dividing grate thing. Yeah. And he says, what are you doing? And he says, well, I really need it. I'll pay for it. And he breaks out his wallet, and then end scene. And it's like, what in the world was the point of that little bit? Like,
no idea.
Except I think that I saw in the end credits that the guy who played the priest is related to Bob Shaye in some way. His last name is Shaye. So it was like, did they really want to squeeze a little cameo in here for this guy to have this dumb little pointless scene? And then, of course, they go out to the junkyard. And so what is the implication here? Is Nancy's dad, he was a sheriff or a police officer in the first movie, right?
Yes.
And he still has his little sheriff's badge, right?
Yeah, he's still in uniform.
But his uniform, on his patches on the shoulders, say security.
Oh, I don't know. So maybe he's been demoted or something.
But he's still wearing his sheriff's badge? I don't know, because then they drive up to this junkyard, which, he knows because he was part of... I guess, was he part of the parents who off Freddy? Yeah. So he knows where they left him, and it turns out it's in the trunk of a car in this junkyard. But they pull up to the junkyard. He gets out of his car, and he goes up and he unlocks the gate to the junkyard. And I was like, does this guy just have keys to everything? Or is he security at the junkyard now? I couldn't quite get that.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't even notice the whole security thing. I just assumed that he was in the same position he was before, but it would make more sense that he wasn't. I mean, he's clearly, a drunk now and not dealing well with the events of the previous movies, so I'm not sure. There are a few inconsistencies, okay, so they're there in the graveyard and they find the remains or whatever, and Neil starts digging a hole. Meanwhile, back at Weston Hills, the remaining ones all hypnotize themselves again and go back and find find Kristen in the quiet room, which is a padded room, and Nancy keeps saying, it's so important we stay together, it's so important we stay together. But as soon as they're in there, Freddy starts like from the outside, like he doesn't appear, but like from the outside, you see his blades shredding the walls, and so they're all encased in these swirling feathers, and they get split up. This is the part that we were talking about earlier where it gets a little bit disappointing, because Taryn faces Freddy first, and she faces him. I mean, she looks, it's so 80s and ridiculous, but I
it's
love
awesome.
it. She's got this huge mohawk and like the fingerless gloves and a leather jacket, and that's how we envisioned badasses in the 80s, I guess.
Yeah. Now we just laugh at that.
Right. And she's in this back alley, and she faces off with Freddy, and they barely get a chance to even fight at all before he says, let's not fight, we used to be friends. And he lifts up his hands, and both of them, his fingers are syringes. And he takes the syringes and he injects them into her arms, and there are cool practical effects with her veins bulging out and her face getting distorted. And I read that her head was supposed to explode, but they just couldn't get it to look right, so she just dies. And like literally the whole scene is maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes. And it's unfortunate. I would have liked to have seen her to have the opportunity to kick his ass for a little while. I mean, I figured she was going to die, but it would have been nice to see her get to have a little bit of fun.
Yeah.
But she doesn't. And then almost immediately, then it cuts to Will. Freddy first threatens him with this big, scary wheelchair. And, like, he's in this big hallway, and the wheelchair that has, like, spinning spiky wheels and blades and things, it starts approaching him. And he kind of dodges it the first time, but his legs get cut, so he's on the ground. And Freddy taunts him, but then he's like, no, I am the Dream Wizard. And he stands up and he shoots like lightning out of his hands, and like it stuns Freddy for a second. But then Will just like starts running at him like, I'm the Dream Wizard. And Freddy just grabs him and lifts him up in the air and kills him. And that's it. Like, again, like 2 minutes max.
Yeah.
And it just it was a letdown. Especially since we're building up into the last 20-30 minutes of the movie. Give me some showdown.
And maybe, they were just trying to up the kills. Maybe they were, again, like I said earlier, trying to show how useless these powers can be against the guy who ultimately has control of the dreams. And so you're supposed to just feel that much more intense going to the last bit of it. But I feel like you do. And it's funny because I remember these kills very vividly. They were pretty iconic, especially the Taryn's, situation with the needles and the drugs and whatnot. But at the end of the day, in the context of the movie, it's pretty sad.
Yeah.
No, I was with you on that, and that was a bit of a shocker for me too. The others end up kind of finding one another. I think they more or less assemble back in the house, and a giant door appears in front of them, just floating and suspended in the air. Nancy's line is, "Look, a door." And I was like, wow. Sometimes the writing in this movie isn't the best, but in any case, yeah, they go through the door, and where they end up in is a huge spiral staircase that goes down to the pits of hell.
The boiler room.
Yeah, the boiler room, basically, which is where a lot of, this movie and these movies end up. And sure enough, Joey, who I'd almost forgotten about by this point, isn't dead yet. He's still suspended by these tongues over a flaming fire pit down in the bottom there. And they barge in. And as Freddy slowly starts to release the tongues from Joey, they're able to get to him in time to, I think, as Nancy, somebody grabs him.
Yeah.
And then the others. And this is the closest thing we really get to a bit of a battle between them, with them using their powers, right? Because you get the strength of Kincaid, who is able to help ultimately pull Joey up. You have the acrobatics of Kristen, who is able to occupy Freddy for a little while.
Yeah. Even that is cut short, because meanwhile, in the graveyard, Neil is burying the remains, and it appears that somehow Freddy is alerted to this fact, and so he disappears out of the fight.
Yeah.
And then, again, totally messing with the rules. somehow Freddy re-embodies his skeleton, and the skeleton fights. Well, first of all, it kills John Saxon's character, and then it fights Neil and throws him into the pit. Which, again, what? Like, how is Freddy doing this? But okay, and it gives you a fun little kind of Evil Dead stop motion skeleton moment.
I was thinking Jason and the Argonauts myself.
Yeah, well, very similar. But, I was reading about goofs and continuity and stuff. The Freddy skeleton is wearing his glove, which doesn't make any sense because they took the glove. Remember, the mom had it in their furnace in the first movie, and it showed up in the second movie, too.
I didn't even notice he was wearing the glove because he's not slashing at him, is he? He's got like a big pipe or something he's fighting him with.
Yeah.
Or no, he's fighting him with the shovel, maybe.
Once Freddy has Neil taken care of, he then returns, and he starts taunting them again, and the kids and Nancy end up in this hall of mirrors. And I don't mean like a funhouse hall of mirrors, just like a long hall with lots of like framed mirrors. Right. So Freddy appears in all of these mirrors and starts pulling them in. And I thought that it just looked pretty good, but I read that they had so much trouble with this because it was pre-CGI. So really what they were doing was just working with reflective mylar. And knowing that, it looks pretty damn good.
Especially impressive, yeah, it really is.
But Joey finds his dream strength, which is that he can talk, and so he screams and the mirrors all shatter. And then that's what leads up. Then this is a part of the movie. This is probably the part of the movie that bothers me the most. Joey screams, they all embrace, and Nancy says, "It's over! He's gone!" Like, yeah. Really?
How do
you really think it's going to be that easy? So then her dad shows up in like this angelic light, and he's like, "I've crossed over, but I couldn't leave without saying goodbye to you." And so she goes and she embraces him, but it's not him, it's Freddy, who then knives her in the abdomen. And then Freddy goes after Kristen, but Nancy jumps up from behind him, grabs his glove, and impales him. Meanwhile, in the graveyard, Neil has woken up, has thrown Freddy's remains in the grave, and throws the holy water on them, which apparently has the effect that it's supposed to, because Freddy starts to kind of dissipate and disintegrate into this light, and he disappears. And he's gone. Kristen grabs Nancy and is holding her and is crying.
"I won't let you die. I won't let you. I'm gonna dream you into a beautiful dream. Forever and ever."
Then they wake up and everything's fine, and the last scene that we get is Neil sleeping, and apparently he has Kristen's model of the house, and the light turns on. Now, my indication was that meant that Freddy was still around.
Yeah.
What I read was that this was supposed to be the last movie. I feel like they said that with pretty much every movie after the first one. But this was supposed to be the last one. And they deleted a scene where somebody was talking to Kristen after the final events, and they asked her, "Do you ever dream about Nancy?" And she said, "I see her every night." And the implication was that Nancy was now like her dream guardian. And so when you saw Neil and you saw the light go on in the house, it wasn't supposed to be implied that that was Freddy that was still around, but rather that it was Nancy, and that now that she was the guardian of the Dream Warriors.
Right, because the light shines on that little statue of the Thai Dream Guardian or whatever that they've got on there.
Right.
I can kind of see that symbolism now that you mention it, but you're right. My interpretation, probably everybody else's in seeing this movie without that scene, is that, Freddy's not gone.
Right.
So, yeah, it's a little silly. The ending gets a little silly. I know they're going for big and they're going for complicated in here, but this notion, like you said, that Freddy can reassemble his skeleton and do this battle at the beginning of the world, and then end it by tossing 2 scoopfuls of dirt on this guy and thinking he's finished the job, and then dropping apart and coming back in to finish off the rest of the kids, he was just setting himself up for disappointment later, you know?
Yeah. I mean, all it takes in the next movie is for a dog to pee fire on his grave and he comes back.
Yeah. True.
Part 4 does pick up exactly where Part 3 left off. They recast Patricia Arquette. There are various stories. Some people say that she turned it down because apparently she did not have a good time making this movie. The budgetary and time constraints made it a really stressful work environment, and it was her first movie. It was particularly hard on her. Her first day of shooting, they were running so late that she didn't even start filming until 4 a.m, and by that time she had forgotten her lines, and so they ended up having to do like 40-some takes before they eventually just made up cue cards and let her read them from behind the camera. And so she didn't have a good time. So by some accounts, she was offered it and decided not to come back. By other accounts, she had already been offered other things and her career was taking off, so she didn't come back. By other accounts, they didn't even bother to offer it to her because her career was taking off and they didn't think they could get her back. But one way or another, she didn't come back. Tuesday Night took over her role, and Tuesday Night ended up getting killed in the first 15 minutes of the movie. But Joey returned, Kincaid returned, and then it took a new course with new characters, including Alice, who was the heroine of the next 2 movies. I'm still a fan of the movie. Again, it's not aging particularly well, but I just think that there's so much good stuff going on in it that I can still appreciate it for what it is and for how I remember it, and I still think it's a good time.
It's a real spectacle, you know, and that is, it's not disappointing in that way. And like you said before, some of the most iconic kills of the franchise, and because they're creative, and that's why I really enjoyed the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, even more so than like Friday the 13th and these others, because they have the ability at least to be creative, super creative with the kills, because we're talking about the dream world, and so they take full advantage of that at every turn, and that's what's really fun, I think, about watching the series, even though they get silly, even though the Freddy character, you know, kind of changes, and even at the times when it seems to play fast and loose with the rules, you can still watch it for these creative kills and the cool special effects that go into it. And that's really, I think, the core, maybe one of the core, besides the Freddy character himself, draws of the whole franchise. It's this movie, like you said, that really cements things. It kind of resets the base for them to launch the rest of the franchise in, and it make a little bit more sense after number 2 kind of knocks it off the rails a little bit. So that's the good part of the movie. And then there's some silly things about this movie that's just chalk it up to low budget, chalk it up to bad acting, chalk it up to not the best writing in the world, and also the fact that I think that this was intended at least to be the last film in the franchise. It makes some of the choices have a little more sense, like that Nancy is killed, that her father is killed, and also this nun thing showing up. It's like they had to shoehorn in like a final explanation of Freddy. Yeah. But ultimately, having this nun mysteriously appearing in this movie as kind of a ghost or whatever doesn't really fit. It feels a little out of place, unless it were, again, the last in the series, in which that would make a lot more sense and wouldn't seem so weird. So I enjoyed it. Like I said, a little disappointed because I remembered it a little bit better than it ended up being. But
me too. At
the end of the day, compared to the rest of them, one of the better in the franchise for sure. They're not all fantastic movies. We can't pretend it's Citizen Kane, you know?
No, I still thought 4 was fun. 4 was directed by Rennie Harlan, and I really enjoyed that one. 5, I don't know. It was kind of pushing it for me. 6, I hated it. 6 just went full-on goofball, and I hated it. But then they came back with New Nightmare, which I freaking loved and still do.
And even Freddy versus Jason, we really liked that one.
Yeah, it was fun. Yeah, I doubt that we'll ever get to see Robert Englund as Freddy again. Now, I say that, but he did just reprise the role on American sitcom The Goldbergs this Halloween. After saying that he would absolutely never do it again. Yeah, because he hates the makeup process. And I think he's 70 or nearing 70.
Oh my gosh.
He said he would never do it again. He hates the makeup process, but he just this Halloween reprised the role in full makeup. Now, granted, he was only in the show for less than 5 minutes, but it was him. And since, in talking about that and doing publicity for that, he's kind of said, well, never say never. So you never know, but the guy is getting old.
Maybe we're going to see some Indiana Jones Kingdom of the Crystal Skull kind of reboot where Freddy is an old, aging guy who's got to pass the torch to some other child murderer who visits kids in their dreams.
Yeah, maybe. I tell you what, if they got him back in the makeup for one more sequel, I would be there opening weekend.
Oh, for
bet
sure.
your ass. I couldn't keep myself away. But anyway, we're left with a legacy. I'm left with my box set of the entire series that I treasure, and they're fun to go back to. And I'm glad that we returned to this series for our 150th. Maybe if we get around to 300, we'll check out part 4 or something.
Maybe. You never know.
but not the abomination that is the remake. I just refuse. I can't watch that again.
I never even saw it myself.
Don't.
Didn't
It's
have
terrible.
the heart. Well, thank you all for sticking with us for 150 episodes, especially those of you who've been with us from the very beginning.
Yeah.
If you haven't been with us from the very beginning, you can catch all 149. They're up. They're up on our website, twoguys.red40net.com. They're also up on iTunes and Google Play, wherever podcasts are. We're not going anywhere. We're going to be on for the foreseeable future. We've got a lot more planned, and we're coming up into Christmas season now. Yep. So we gotta somehow figure out 4 more holiday-themed movies to do, and I'm sorry to say it's going to start to get pretty trashy.
I've got some ideas. We'll be all right.
Okay, good. I can't wait to hear them. Until next time, I'm Todd.
And I'm Craig.
With 2 Guys and a Chainsaw.